So Syria is being welcomed back into the Arab fold. Iran and Saudi Arabia have buried the hatchet. Russia and Saudi Arabia have joined hands to control the oil market. So a proxy war in Syria does not make sense anymore. The Saudis are talking. The Russians want to play peacemakers, and the Syrians may be able to end their global isolation. Basically, it suits everyone, except for the US, which is nowhere in the picture. In the last few weeks, Bashar al-Assad has been traveling. He visited the UAE and Oman. They made it look like a post-earthquake outreach. You know, apart from Turkey, Syria also suffered because of the quakes last month, and the Arabs are now giving humanitarian assistance. But this was also a way to re-induct Assad into the international fold. And Saudi Arabia is leading this front, this effort. Its foreign minister said there is growing consensus that Syria should be brought back into the Arab League. Syria was booted from the league in 2011. Now it may rejoin. The next Arab League summit will be held in the month of May, and the Saudis will host it. Where does all of this leave the US? What is America doing while the West Asian countries realign? America is bombing Syria. It carried out multiple airstrikes last night. These were in eastern Syria. The targets were groups aligned with Iran. The US blames them for a drone attack that took place yesterday. The attack led to 1 death and 6 injuries, so the Americans are raining fire now. But even with all this firepower, they're losing in this game. US allies are striking peace deals against its wishes. Meanwhile, Russia is doubling down. Reports say Russian jets fly over American military bases almost every day now. It's as though the US is being hemmed in from all sides. Could this be the end of the US dictating moves in West Asia? Honestly, that's still probably a long way off. But it's certainly the beginning, and perhaps the US realizes this. Reports say it's relocating advanced fighter jets from West Asia to the Pacific and Europe. It is sending aging planes to West Asia instead. The US is reportedly looking to focus on China and Russia and perhaps leave West Asia to look after itself, which it's doing anyway. Remember, Joe Biden had promised to make Saudi Arabia a pariah on the global stage. Now it seems it's Saudi Arabia that is making the US an outcast in the region.
Of the Iran-Russia partnership is their cooperation in the energy sector. Russia is a major oil and gas producer, and Iran has significant energy reserves, making the two countries natural partners in the energy market. In addition to their economic ties, Iran and Russia share concerns about regional security. Both countries have been involved in the Syrian conflict, with Russia providing military support to the Assad regime and Iran supporting Shia militias fighting against ISIS. This cooperation has helped to stabilize the situation in Syria and has contributed to the defeat of ISIS in the country. The growing Iran-Russia partnership has also raised concerns in Western quarters. Some observers have suggested that this alliance could pose a massive threat to the US and its allies in the region. Iran-Saudi Arabia normalization in Beijing is a major turning point in the recomposition of the Middle East. Just a month back, not even a hardcore realist would have thought that the Saudi and Iranian governments would shake hands to restore diplomatic relations without American intervention. Arguably, the deal is an indication that the US influence in West Asia may be waning and relatively an increase in China's clout. To be clear, the US-Iran ties have remained frosty since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, when Ayatollah Khomeini led a coup against the Shah Reza Pahlavi regime. Subsequently, the 44-day-long hostage crisis involving US diplomats and citizens in Tehran in 1979 to 1981 added insult to injury. Since then, Iran has been a part of the so-called axis of evil, a phrase coined by former US President George Bush for Iran and North Korea in 2002. In September 2020, when the US mediated between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain to sign the Abraham Accords, it was assumed that the Western nation could soon have Saudi Arabia joining the forum and rallying against Iran. However, Saudi Arabia took a cautious approach and didn't join the accord. The COVID-19 crisis and the Russia-Ukraine war detoured the US from prioritizing the Gulf region. The slowdown of the economy due to the COVID-19 crisis and China's growing influence in the South Pacific region dealt a heavy blow to the US. The Iranian regime back home was facing huge protests as its economy had gone to the dogs because of global economic sanctions. It couldn't afford to stay hostile to the global powers for long. The regime in the Shia nation decided to change its stance and open the door for reconciliation. China, which is Iran's biggest business partner and also purchases oil from Saudi Arabia in large quantities, saw it as an opportunity. It tried to forge a deal between the two Gulf nations. The deal can work on different platforms. Good relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran will lead to fewer conflicts in the region. The Saudi and the Iranian regimes have supported proxies in conflict-ridden areas like Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. If they work on the peace of the area, there will be fewer conflicts and the oil rate is likely to drop. The growing Iran-Iraq relations have indeed posed a challenge to US ambitions in the Middle East region. The US has historically had a significant presence and influence in the Middle East and has sought to maintain its strategic interests and influence in the region. Iran and Iraq, two of the largest and most powerful countries in the Middle East, have historically had a contentious relationship, particularly during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. However, in recent years, the two countries have taken steps to improve their relations, particularly since the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq in 2003. The US has been concerned about the growing relationship between Iran and Iraq, particularly as Iran has been accused of supporting Shiite militias in Iraq and attempting to exert influence over Iraqi politics. Recently, Iraq and Iran have even signed a border security agreement, a move Iraqi officials say is aimed primarily at tightening the frontier with Iraq's Kurdish region, where Tehran says Kurdish armed groups pose a threat to its security. Under the signed security deal, Iraq pledged it would not allow armed groups to use its territory in the Iraqi Kurdish region to launch any border-crossing attacks on neighboring Iran. The growing Iran-Iraq relations have thus posed a challenge to US ambitions in the region by potentially reducing its influence and leverage in Iraq. This could have significant implications for the US and its strategic interests in the Middle East, particularly if Iraq becomes more closely aligned with Iran and less willing to cooperate with the US. The changing power dynamics within the West Asian nations has been coupled with a dwindling influence of America and NATO in the region. You see, NATO's involvement in the Middle East has been a complex and evolving issue over the past few decades. However, the alliance's focus and priorities in the region did shift after its involvement in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Before the conflict, NATO had been heavily involved in the Middle East. However, soon after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, NATO's priorities shifted towards countering Russian aggression and enhancing its presence in Eastern Europe. This led to a reduction in NATO's involvement in the Middle East and a shift in focus towards its traditional role of deterring and defending against Russian aggression in Europe. This shift in focus, coupled with the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East and the rise of non-state actors such as ISIS, left a power vacuum in the region that other actors including Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey sought to fill. This resulted in increased involvement and influence by these actors in the Middle East, often at the expense of NATO's interests and objectives. This has prompted America to save its sinking ship, and thus we are witnessing an unprecedented push by Washington to revive the Iran nuclear deal in its last-ditch attempt to maintain its influence in the region. All said and done, Iran's emergence as a major regional power is a force to reckon with. Despite years of economic sanctions by the US, Iran has managed to develop a strong domestic industry and maintain its position as an important energy exporter. Its military strength and involvement in regional conflicts have also contributed to its rising influence in the Middle East. While its rise as a power has been controversial, Iran has demonstrated that it is willing to defend its interests and will not be easily intimidated by external pressures.